这是冷启动。
This is cold start?
That's an interesting way to start the episode.
I think that's what it said.
So, kind of going off of our conversation about Porsche last time and the interesting financial situation that they find themselves in for multiple reasons, but some of the main ones were their investment into the EV market, which is, as we've seen, not been the most successful strategy,
Right.
but also fighting in the Chinese market against these new Chinese manufacturers that have come up to kind of dominate the automotive industry, especially in China. And now they're starting to expand outward, places like Mexico, Canada, getting close to the United States, as well as potentially starting to infiltrate the European market as well. And this conversation of Chinese auto manufacturer always kind of seems like a joke, but I feel like we're starting to laugh less and less as they start to get pretty serious in putting out some pretty incredible cars as well.
Yeah, this has transitioned from haha funny to wait, what? Is this coming? To now I think we're in the point where we're starting to understand what is looming, and it's actually a little scary once you realize the implications and the magnitude of it all. And so we thought we'd help educate all of you, including ourselves, about this current wave, this development that's happening in a part of the world where there's a lot of people paying attention, but we don't seem to be too closely.
Yeah, and I think the best way to start this off is kind of where have we experienced Chinese cars so far as car enthusiasts, right? Paying attention to whether that's the news or maybe some, cool videos on the internet or even some events in the real world that we've experienced these cars so far, and then starting to get into kind of what is their plan of attack, these manufacturers potentially getting into motorsports, which is a whole nother thing.
Yeah, in the beginning, when we were first hearing about Chinese cars, right, the discussions were always, oh, that's just a knockoff of this other brand of vehicle. And the models, if you looked at them, they looked like sort of poor quality translations, if you will, of an existing car. Like I remember seeing a knockoff of a Porsche Cayenne at one point. It looked like kind of an ugly Cayenne. And over time, what's happened is the market and the industry in China serving specifically their own market has matured very rapidly. And they've been watching what's going on in the rest of the world. They are obviously paying close attention to the technology developments, and they also lack some of the IP restrictions that make it difficult for new innovators to come into the field in places where there are such restrictions in place. So we've seen this, what feels like sudden onslaught of all these companies that have names that we don't know or aren't familiar to us, building cars that at once seemed maybe like kind of a joke, but now are not just plausible, but actually performing in line with the highest level performance sports cars that we have in the industry. And then beyond that, with ambitions toward motorsport. So it's a really interesting time. And I think it's going to catch a lot of people sleeping. This has been a growth that's been occurring for maybe 20 years or so. And we just have so little visibility into that here in the US.
Yeah, and I think that's why like the Nurburgring lap record situation is so prevalent because yes, there is the Chinese manufacturer of producing generic consumer cars, but going after these records in a motorsports sense, doing these lap times showcases their capabilities as a company. And usually we reserve like setting a record or going after these record times for these very well established manufacturers that have been doing it for decades and decades and decades. And so for a Chinese manufacturer to come out with one of their cars, an EV, right, a fully electric car, but be able to set a record at the Nürburgring for a production EV and a production sedan was kind of insane.
Yeah, again, caught a lot of people by surprise just because we're not familiar with these brand names, the company names. They're hard to pronounce in English. That hasn't necessarily been considered all along. Back long ago when we were starting to open up the world to each other and markets were starting to sell products outside their local place, we first learned how difficult this was. And there's sort of an apocryphal story now, but about how when Coca-Cola was first introduced to China back in the early 1900s, there was a very poor localization of the translated name of Coca-Cola, such that, again, apocryphally, theoretically, the translation to English meant bite the wax tadpole. So clearly, that has nothing to do with the product. We have to be thinking about these things in a different way and understanding each other in a way that was obviously not considered long ago when this all started out. Now where we are today, we hear about the names of companies like BYD, Build Your Dreams, or Yangwang, which is actually a brand within the BYD consortium, or Xiaomi, who we think of mostly as a mobile phone manufacturer. All of these companies have real product that is not just shipping, but is out there performing at levels that are comparable to what we expect from the long-standing sort of classic performance automakers, Ferrari, Porsche, Ford, GM. All these companies are out there, and they're actually being shown up by brand new, virtually unheard of companies from China.
Yeah, so to go about the Nurburgring lap times and move on from that, but Yangwang came out with their U9 Extreme EV and was
Right.
able to set a lap time record at the Nurburgring of a 6:59, which is an insanely quick time.
Yeah, 7 minutes as a benchmark for any really fast car is haul in the mail. That's super fast.
Yeah, and so this set the record for EVs and four-door EV. But then shortly after that, Porsche, obviously that being kind of their home track, their backyard, their home turf of Germany, came back and retook the record back from the Chinese with their Taycan Mantai edition and was able to set a time of a 6:55. So these times are close. That's the thing to recognize here is you think like, all right, Porsche's been around the block. They know how to do performance
Yeah.
and track stuff, and they're only able to beat them by an additional 4 seconds.
And that's not just the stock Taycan that they're producing that you can go buy from Porsche. This is with the Mantai Racing added package aftermarket that they're still calling a production car.
Right.
So it's a little bit of a squint to say that that's equivalent. And
It's on the gray zone.
yeah, well, let's also point out Porsche is paying very close attention to this. They were very aware of this record being set where
Oh, yeah.
many of us enthusiasts maybe had no idea, oh, it's an EV record, maybe we don't pay as close attention, but it's also this company and this car that maybe most of us haven't even heard of.
Right. And in an honorable mention in this space, because there was a prototype time that got set as well by a Chinese manufacturer, which was Xiaomi, that phone company that is well known and well established in China. They brought out a prototype of their SU7 Ultra. And once again, EV vehicle, but that was able to put down a time of 6 minutes, 22 seconds, which is just ungodly fast. I think the only thing that's faster in the EV category that accompanies prototypes and production vehicles was the Volkswagen IDR, which did a low 6 minute. I think it did like a 6 minute, 3 second lap time. And so we're talking about really well performing vehicles here in this space, which you can kind of see now that, once again, we're not really thinking about these Chinese manufacturers being high performance vehicles, but they're kind of proving it out in the real world and making it happen, which leads us to believe this conversation that we'll get to a little bit later about the motorsport side of Chinese manufacturers getting into motorsport. But even other companies like Hypetech, I'm sure we're going to butcher every single manufacturer name on this list, but they did a viral video with their SSR hypercar. They kind of did like a Gymkhana knockoff where they had this EV sliding and drifting and doing all sorts of stunts through some town in China.
Kicking soccer balls into the net.
Right, yeah, doing weird random stuff, but once again trying to establish themselves within the space of car culture as like, hey, we're a brand doing cool stuff, and we're not just, producing appliance style vehicles. Like, we can produce some pretty serious equipment here. And they even set a Guinness World Record for the fastest drift in an EV car, which was an impressive 132 miles an hour. But
I'm not sure what that means.
Right.
Yeah.
But like there's some debate on the internet of like whether this drift was an actual drift or it was just a slide or spin out, because like he didn't really like snap it back into line. It kind of just like lazily spun at the very end of it. But nonetheless, these manufacturers are trying to do cool things and make themselves relevant in this space.
And they're innovating, right? They're doing things that we haven't seen done before or haven't seen done in a commercial way before, that were just experimental. The crawl mode of some of the trucks that they put out there, the cars that jump had that active suspension, like that old Bose suspension that existed, that people would drive over these speed bumps and the car wouldn't move at all.
Yeah, I think there is a Chinese manufacturer that has a hypercar that can do that, like jump action or like kneels down, or there's other ones that they're like, yeah, we can fully submerge it in water. Like, there's a bunch of gimmicky stuff going on in the Chinese space.
But it's really interesting because we don't see that kind of stuff in the established auto manufacturer world. None of them
That's
are out
true.
there trying new things like this. You know, Yangwang put out their EV. It was a 1200-volt architecture. Now, Porsche was being called out and heralded for their 800-volt architecture in the Taycan. And this company came out and said, yeah, hold my beer. I'm
Watch
going to
this.
watch this 1200 volts, right? And yeah, there's, I'm sure, elements of their car that operate at lower voltage because it would need to. But that's not something we've heard from any of the, let's call them Western auto manufacturers.
Yeah.
And they're not alone, right? You mentioned this hype-tech car, this SSR. We have Neo, and that's a car that the name has been bouncing around even though they've only existed for about 10 years as a company, the Neo EP9. From this company, founded in 2014, they have now produced a car that can drive 217 miles an hour, has about 1,360 horsepower equivalent, will do 0 to 200 kilometers an hour in 7 seconds, and is reputed to have double the downforce of a Formula One car.
I mean, just insane stats. And I feel like that's kind of the consistency through a lot of these cars that come out of China, is that on the hypercar realm, the supercars, the stats on the vehicles are just insane, of horsepower numbers, 0 to 60, 0 to 100, 0 to 200, top speeds, downforce capabilities. Like, they're going for it. And I guess this is back to the whole thing of like the innovation, where back in the day we used to see crazy innovation from the Europeans, from the Americans in this performance sense, but nowadays they're kind of like stuck in their ways and not really doing anything crazy. And now that the Chinese market is trying to establish themselves, all these manufacturers are like, well, what do we have to lose? Like, we need to grab people's attention.
Yeah.
And this whole concept of like these Chinese hypercars, for me at least, it was like, they're on the internet, they're far, far away. They're in the Eastern Hemisphere. Like, they're not in my backyard, right?
Right.
They're not relevant yet in, I guess, our market space. But funny enough, as we were going through this list and I looked at the Neo EP9, I'm like, man, this thing looks familiar. And I recall that we just had Velocity here at Sonoma Raceway.
Yeah.
Unbelievable event, attracts a bunch of cars, one-of-ones, whatevers, multi-million-dollar vehicles. And I remember seeing this like crazy car, hand-painted livery, like beautiful. And it was a Neo. It was one of these EP9s that had been hand-painted by an artist. But here it was sitting in my backyard at Sonoma
Wow.
Raceway, which, once again, these vehicles aren't necessarily legalized in America yet,
Right.
because of restrictions, governmental restrictions and stuff like that.
Yeah, you can bring anything to the racetrack, though, so that's fine.
Exactly. Yeah, it wasn't necessarily registered or whatever it was, but it's kind of like, all right, this is relevant. This is prevalent.
Yeah.
This is right here, right now. These cars are at car events in America. They're doing record-setting runs in like a motorsports sense in our space. And so it makes it seem like, yeah, this is kind of happening here and now. And I think things are going to continue to ramp up quicker and quicker. And sooner rather than later, we're going to see that's like, yeah, Chinese manufacturers are here to take over.
The Neo EP9 that was at Velocity Invitational, was that a static display or did they actually get it out for lapping and stuff?
I didn't see it on track. I don't know if it was a part of like, they had a hypercar display,
Right, yeah.
which had a bunch of really, really cool stuff. And I'm sure that they did like a hypercar parade lap or something like that, but
Sure, yeah.
I didn't see it move. I didn't see it moving, but I'm sure it still ran. Like, it was a fully operational car.
It's really interesting. And as we're kind of total newbies to these kind of cars, learning about them and observing things about them, something I noted is the number 9 pops up a lot. It's kind of funny. There's the Yangwang U9 Extreme. We have the Neo EP9 vehicle. And then there's another one by a company called Hongqi, which is or Hongji, I don't know, the S9. So there's something about like that biggest number that we're conveying. We're at the top of this thing. We're coming in. We're shooting for the moon. Hongqi is interesting in that it's a subsidiary of a company called the FAW Group, the FAW Group. And there are 4 auto manufacturers that are referred to as kind of the big 4 Chinese state-owned auto manufacturers. So this is to say, China, the government, owns these companies.
Oh,
and
wow.
there are other companies that operate theoretically outside of that. It's anybody's guess whether or not that's actual or just the cover story. But FAW Group being one, SAIC Motor, which stands for Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, and they're huge. By total volume, they're the largest. The FAW Group I mentioned, they're sort of a luxury brand, Hongqi in particular, and they have some joint ventures already going with Toyota and Audi and VW. There's another company called the Dongfeng Motor Corporation, which produces passenger vehicles, trucks, and already has some partnerships out there with Honda and Stellantis and Nissan. And then the Chang'an Automobile Group, based in Chongqing, is state-owned and a big player in sort of the new EV kind of field. They have a few sub-brands called Deepal and Avator, if I'm saying those things correctly. So all of these companies, and those are all just the state-owned ones, and BYD and Geely Group and some others that exist outside of this are even further entries and existing companies in the Chinese auto market today. So a lot of names that are pretty unfamiliar to most of us. The closest I've gotten to one of these is I actually rode in a BYD here in the US, where they are theoretically illegal. That occurred on the Facebook campus. So in Menlo Park, Facebook has this giant campus that actually spans a public road. And they're on-campus shuttles that they use to take you intra-campus, so theoretically not on any public roads.
Private property
are BYDs. And I remember getting in this vehicle when I was there in the campus to visit a friend or something and be like, what the heck is this thing? And it felt kind of cheap, but looked like, kind of a lower-end economy family utility vehicle. And that was my first influence or my first impression of them. That was back in, I want to say 2016 timeframe. So fast forward to now, they're still not legal on the roads, but they're popping up in these places where you can kind of skirt the requirements for the public roads if you're not going to be using it in that way. For example, bringing it to a racetrack or using it on private property, not out on the public roads. But what's going to happen is there will be at some point a change. And we are seeing these cars, BYD in particular, as well as other manufacturers, start to make it into markets that are very close to us, in Mexico, in Canada. And what that means is eventually there will be people who are nationals of those countries buying those vehicles from China and bringing them over to the U.S. because you're allowed to do that, right? We see Canadian license plates and Mexican license plates every so often, people who are here on vacation or touring or whatever.
Yeah.
So we're going to start to see those cars on the road here.
Yeah, this whole, development in regards to these Chinese hypercars. Yeah, I've seen one in person. You see them on the internet. But I mean, for the longest time back in the day when these manufacturers were coming out with their prototypes or their hypercars or whatever and just giving you pictures and stats, I always just assumed that the manufacturers that were developing their hypercars in China were almost like the Devil 16 situation. I don't know if you remember that car from the UAE.
It took me a minute to remember that, but I know what you're talking about. Devil was it was DEVEL?
Yes. The 16, which was basically this car that they claimed all these crazy numbers, crazy top speed. The design was insane looking, and it was vaporware. It never existed. It never ran. It couldn't do anything that it claimed to do. And so I always kind of had that same impression of looking at the Chinese market and these manufacturers, especially in the hypercar sense, because it's I know that they can make, consumer commuter cars, for sure. That's relatively simple.
Right.
But for creating these performance vehicles, I always just assume it's China. We've seen them kind of, they've inflated numbers before. From that perspective of hey, we're going to create this car that can do 0 to 60 and whatever, and a top speed of this, that, the other. It's yeah, cool. You're saying that. And so in the beginning, I always had the impression that, they were just lying to an extent. And
because they do. There are companies at the top end where people are trying to make a name.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of funny business. There's shenanigans. There's lying. There's cheating. There's false impressions of capability being shown. And this happens a lot in new technology. A little tangent, but I worked in robotics for a while, and the reality of the coolest robotics displays you see are that you're seeing the few seconds of good footage where it worked, and you're not seeing them poking the robot with a broomstick from off stage, because they literally do that kind of stuff, and that's the reality. So now we're in a place where, okay, we're trying to show off new capability. We have to look good compared to places and entities that have way more financial backing and capability, sophistication than we do. So maybe we'll cut some corners to make it look like we're a little better than we are. So I had that same impression too. These stats that are coming out are just ungodly. The video you see maybe isn't as clear as it could otherwise be, or the fidelity of it isn't as good as we'd expect. But the reality is these are starting to look competitive and plausible. And they're stacking up against Lamborghini and Porsche and Ferrari kind of numbers in comparable places.
And that's the thing is Nurburgring is releasing the official video. So it's these companies are now legitimized in what they're doing. And that's what kind of makes like, oh man, I kind of assumed that this was a joke, or, they're just trying to like establish themselves and say whatever. And it's like, no, they're actually like, they're doing. And speaking of that, of like them legitimizing themselves and being a real force in the industry, specifically motorsports, there's a lot of these companies that are starting to look at trying to get involved in racing teams and going and racing in legitimate series like WEC, like F1. And so I think it might be cool of looking at some of these companies that are looking to get into these areas of racing and who's getting involved, what timelines are we looking at? Because it's like, I feel like a lot of these Chinese manufacturers are mainly based in EV technologies, and racing right now, thankfully, isn't fully EV. But, is there a time frame in which that might transition? And is the involvement and the potential investments from these Chinese manufacturers going to influence where motorsports goes next?
Yeah, I think there is existing motorsports that's been growing in China, in Asia, in a way that we're less aware of here. Of course, there is the Asian Le Mans Series, ALMS, which is sort of an equivalent to ELMS that feeds up into the WEC championship overall.
Yeah.
So there is stuff going on there that we're sort of just not as aware of. But ALMS at least kind of maps into this structure of the World Endurance Championship and Le Mans racing the way we think about it. But then there's a lot of other series that we have no idea about that are going on in China today and are highlighting some of these same manufacturers. So it's not as if they're coming from zero, but they're entering a world where they're now on the same playing field with other companies that have had existing rules and technologies in place for a long time, and their investments to back it up are considerable. So there is a little bit of a resistance to make changes that are going to advantage the new players at a disadvantaging of those players who'd been there all along, kind of building those leagues, building the technology, sort of that legacy Ferrari arrangement in F1 kind of a thing. I think we have a little bit of that. And given the landscape, right, we know that between IMSA and WEC, the hypercar standards between GTP and hypercar now are equivalent, and they're going to be in place, reports are, till at least 2032. So you can imagine if you're a company looking at competing in an area where you're not yet, and you have to make modifications to your plans, your design, your technology in order to compete, you want to have there be at least some runway for you to get out there and be there for a while. So we're talking another 6 years of the existing regulations. That's an eternity in racing time for the existing technology to say we're going to freeze what we have now. We're not going to bring any new developments or any new kind of methods into this space. We're going to freeze it the way it is for 6 more years. That's relatively unusual in the history of motorsports. But that's where we are now, and it makes a perfect opening for new companies from places like China to get involved because they can, in the timeline necessary, arrive at technology, designs, cars, performance that can compete and maybe even outcompete some of those existing legacy brands. So let's dig in. I think in addition to the new entries we saw this year by McLaren and Genesis into Hypercar, and by the way, Genesis is Hyundai for those who are less familiar, right? That's their luxury brand like the Acura to Honda or the Lexus is to Toyota. And we have the loss of Porsche in WEC this year, as we talked about in our last episode. So let's talk about this company BYD, Build Your Dreams. We referred to them a little earlier, and that was the car I'd actually ridden in before. So they started back in 1995, which isn't all that long ago for a car company, but they're now a global multinational conglomerate. They started out as a battery company. They were building batteries for electronics that eventually found their way into car platforms. And then through an acquisition, they got involved in the car business directly. The name BYD, it's a backronym, the way we take letters and we make up an acronym for them after the fact.
Right.
So BYD, they say, means build your dreams, which we would all say in English, that's such a terrible name for your company. But that's what they came up with. And the reason is it's mapped from the Chinese phonetic phrase of its initials. The initials they came up in Chinese, the way you'd say it is BYD. And that came from a company called Yadi Electronics, which they'd acquired. And they added the initial B in front of it, BYD, because kind of the equivalent in China to English, they wanted to like show up first in the phone book. Literally, they did this because they thought it would give them an advantage at trade shows to be early on, like high up in the alphabet. So B put them way up above where they would be if they were Y, Yadi.
You'd be on the last page.
At the end of the alphabet, right? So then in 2008, Berkshire Hathaway, no small fish in investing, put $230 million US into this company to purchase just over 9% of it. They have since exited that investment, which is interesting, but I'm sure they did pretty well on that given the growth that's been there.
Right.
Today, you have BYD with subdivisions in automotive, electronics, semiconductors, forklifts, energy storage, mobility and trains, and beyond that. So this isn't just some small company that makes one model of car, right? This is a huge conglomerate. As of 2025, BYD, the company, had 900,000 employees.
That's pretty crazy.
So I can't think of any other car company at that scale. The speculation of them getting involved in racing has been really interesting. And of course, to your point earlier, they've been entirely around battery and EV technology.
Right.
And the highest levels of racing, right, with WEC, IMSA, Formula One, there might be electronics and battery technology involved, hybrid, but it's still heavily combustion-based. So in order to get into this space, BYD has been looking at possible acquisitions to help accelerate their sort of transition in and give them a basis of knowledge in the combustion space. And there have been discussions so far with the Alpine F1 team as well as Aston Martin. And Aston Martin is pretty interesting because reports are Lawrence Stroll is pretty pissed about the team's performance in 2026. They went and hired Adrian Newey. They spent all this money. They keep putting the guy's son in the seat, even though they know they can get a better racer to put in there. And yet they're not as successful as they'd like to be. A shot in the arm of a bunch of cash from China sure looks like it would be just the thing to make them go in a good direction and gives BYD then a plausible entry into motorsports through the existing Aston Martin Formula One team. So it's really interesting as a prospect, which is then furthered by the fact that this company that really has no experience in motorsports at this level, acquisition makes even that much more sense to build up the knowledge, the capability, the team that would be necessary to participate there. So in the background, in Formula One, there's these changes in who runs teams and principals and who drives for whom. And last year, we saw the departure of Christian Horner from the Red Bull team. Christian Horner had been the team principal since the team's founding, so it was a huge change. Well, that guy is out there supposedly in advanced negotiations now with BYD about potentially taking over the Formula One entry if they're able to make one for the BYD automotive program. Potentially that would take the existing Aston Martin and turn it into BYD, the same way we saw Sauber turn into Audi over the last couple of years. So the reports sound legit. I mean, Christian Horner was reported as being seen in meetings with the vice president of engineering and operations for BYD while in Cannes, I guess probably leading up to the Monaco Grand Prix or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is, again, in expectation regarding this F1 project. So there's some complexity here because Aston Martin actually has an engine deal in 2026 with Honda, which would make it a little bit complicated given that these companies don't interact very well. And there's a lot of bad blood and history between Chinese and Japanese firms in a lot of ways, especially Honda, who's been around a long time. But it makes it really interesting to think that this kind of acquisition could really bring BYD to the forefront and have them be a plausible entry into Formula One. We're not just talking about, they managed to, align themselves with some Xfinity second-tier NASCAR team or something like that.
Right.
This is at the upper echelons of all motorsport globally.
And I think that's what's crazy is that how quickly things are going of, it's just Chinese automotive manufacturers. They're kind of a joke. They just copy other people's homework and create cars, to now that they're on the cutting edge of battery technology. And unfortunately, the harsh reality is that's a huge piece of modern motorsports. And I think that's the biggest thing to note here is that Formula One has opened the door for new, I guess, powertrain suppliers to enter into the market space of F1, because now it's not only the internal combustion engine.
That's right.
It's on top of it, it's this hybrid system and the battery system. Now, the interesting thing that I would love to ask the question is, yes, Aston Martin's the main title manufacturer, or Honda is the main internal combustion supplier.
Right.
But why couldn't there be a collaboration or a partnership? Because it's like, I mean, maybe this is me being naive or not knowing. Is Honda developing the internal combustion and the hybrid system with the batteries? Of why wouldn't they try to outsource that to BYD, which is so successful with their battery technology? All right, we use BYD batteries and then we have a Honda powertrain, or it's an Aston Martin motor with BYD hybrid technology, because that seems like the most useful way, because it's like, I don't think BYD creates internal combustion engines, so it's like
Correct.
them taking on the challenge of creating a motor for F1, I think is ridiculous.
Yeah.
But them being an add-in to be like, hey, we know how to run electronics, regenerative systems, whatever it is, and we know how to do that very efficiently, that makes sense as kind of like an add-on.
Yeah, I could totally see that. And you're going to need there to be some interface between these companies, right? At some point, there's the system that manages the overarching power, even though it's a combination of electric power and combustion power. And so there's got to be some clear interfaces or like an API or something defined between them. They're going to have to align on that. They're going to have to partner up on that. That's the only way that they can move forward. And to your point, not every company is going to make everything. You know, even Porsche and Volkswagen Group are relying on Bosch to make ECUs and motor systems and control systems for their cars, right? Like they're not building everything in-house. The same way the American manufacturers historically relied on companies like AC Delco, right? Or whatever you're talking about. They're parts manufacturers that put parts into cars, but they're not necessarily made by the same as the originating manufacturer.
Yeah.
And we're going to see more of this, right? So that's BYD. That's just one of these companies. And while they represent multiple brands, think about like the Volkswagen Auto Group has multiple brands in their portfolio, but
Right.
ultimately there's an overarching parent company, theoretically, you know, making strategic decisions. Stellantis is another one of these consortium that exists today. Same kind of deal, right? Multiple organized operating companies under a parent umbrella organization.
Yeah, another piece that I wanted to add on about like talking about Formula One is, I guess it's something that I haven't really thought about, because it's like you want to ignore the hybrid systems and the battery technology that are in these cars.
Right.
But I was wondering, I was like, okay, like batteries are a huge piece to EVs, electric motors, hybrid systems, how efficient the battery is of holding a charge, displacing a charge, regenerating a charge. Like the battery is like a crazy piece of this whole like element. And so I was thinking, I was like, okay, from the batteries, are they like, you know, spec? Are they spec batteries of like every team has to use the same battery within F1? Or is it kind of like free for all? Like you have to develop your own battery within your own hybrid system. And so I had to look it up, because I was like, I didn't know. And there is no universal battery system, or there is no universal battery within F1. So every team is responsible for developing their own bespoke hybrid system.
Right.
And that kind of opens the door of like, yes, I understand like Mercedes and Ferrari, like they might have more complications of bringing in an outside, quote unquote, battery manufacturer for their cars. But like a team like Red Bull, which I guess now they're teamed up with Ford, so that's not a great example either. But like these smaller teams that don't necessarily have like a direct manufacturer that they're trying to represent, why aren't they going out and trying to get these Chinese companies? Because like we look at the whole scheme of EV cars, the Chinese are at the forefront of battery technology.
For sure.
The best batteries that can charge up the quickest, displace the most amount of power, all that stuff. I mean, we're seeing it in the road-going cars, 3,000 horsepower EVs coming out of China.
Right.
You think like, if I'm an F1 team, yeah, go to the Chinese and let's do a partnership for powertrains so that we can develop like the best hybrid system. Like, yeah, we don't want them to develop the internal combustion engine because they're not known for that. But in regards to the electrification, they are known for that. So I think like this whole conversation about BYD coming into F1, in the beginning of it, it might sound like that's crazy. Like a Chinese manufacturer going into F1 is like insane.
Yeah.
But the further you kind of take a step back, you swallow the pill of like EV is within F1.
Right.
Now this does make a whole lot of sense of like, yeah, why aren't they outsourcing more to the cutting edge of battery people?
It makes sense, you know, and you think about it, for any individual or a company to have ambitions at this level, to like go compete at the top level of a thing when you've never done it before. I mean, that takes some arrogance, but we see that in this space, right? We see big car companies with visions of where it is that they want to go, making big bets. And those companies have been rewarded in the market. So if you're watching what other people are doing and studying it and learning how to be really good at it, anybody who's seen what's been going on in the Western markets for the last 25 years, emulating that and accelerating that, it looks like they're going to be off to the races really fast. Another one of these parent corporations that exists is called the Chery Group. And they have a brand called Exeed, which they want to be the first Chinese car brand to do, and I think that means complete, the 24 Hour of Le Mans. And so, wow, that's a pretty big ambition too. We were just chatting about, I think it's Toyota putting out a experimental hydrogen-based prototype car to enter into the 24 Hour of Le Mans this year, and they're setting their ambitions as far as one complete lap of the circuit. That is to drive just like 8.5 miles. That's not very ambitious. If they were going to go out there and say, we're going to try to compete and complete the race, they can demonstrate their stamina, their durability, the reliability of their plant. That would be really interesting. But no, here's Exeed, which I've never heard of, right? Before we did some research here. They want to go and be the first brand to get into the 24 Hour of Le Mans from China. Not only that, recently they signed a strategic cooperation agreement with the ACO, right? The ACO being the parent organization of FIA. And so this is kind of a multi-phase, multi-year road to Le Mans plan that has been developed. They have talent development that's happening through endurance racing talent selection program in China. This is, again, feeders to the Chinese series and potentially things like ALMS. Entry into ALMS specifically, and that's new because ALMS is adding a hypercar category, which they haven't had before for the 2027 racing season.
Oh, interesting.
So there will be another place for people who go build prototypes to compete in IMSA and WEC and ELMS to go do that over in Asia. And then on top of that, we have ongoing construction. There are existing racetracks in China. There's construction of a new Le Mans certified track in Wuhu, China, which is where Chery is headquartered, conveniently enough. And then we have the formation of this entity called the Exeed Le Mans team to enter the full 24 Hour of Le Mans. And their goal is to debut within the next 5 years. So watch this space still within the envelope of those current regulations for WEC, for ELMS, ALMS, and IMSA. So more exciting stuff happening, and yet another large entity outside of BYD that's kind of sharpening their weaponry, getting ready to make a foray into endurance racing in this particular area.
It'll be fascinating to see whether Exeed developing their own hypercar, if they're going to take it upon themselves to internally create an engine with the hybrid system, or if they try to outsource the internal combustion engine and add their own hybrid system on top of that. So it'll be fascinating if they take on the whole project themselves to develop their own bespoke. And I would assume if they want to be the Chinese manufacturer to complete the first one, to complete the 24 Hours of Le Mans, it'll have to be 100% them. They don't want to take any shortcuts in that aspect. But it'll be fascinating of how you divide up that powertrain. And it's interesting that we have this conversation now in motorsport because the drivetrains are divided of EV and internal combustion.
Right.
And so it's kind of it opens up this door of, are they developing the whole thing, only part of it? Do you outsource it? How do you put all these pieces together? And the whole Toyota premise of the hydrogen fuel cell, I think that's fascinating. We're getting back to that conversation we had about Le Mans, which was this is the place to test stuff and do prototypes and do all that sort of stuff. It is lame that they're only setting their sights on completing one lap. That seems like a lot of wasted time and energy to go to not want to complete the whole race.
It seems overly cautious in this kind of crawl, walk, run way that seems very calculated, and maybe that's what we should expect from Toyota, right? They've been very conservative as a company. They were very late to adopt anything electric, right? They put hybrid out before everybody else, but they've been hanging back, and they look like the smartest dudes in the room, not having turned everything that they make into EVs.
Right, and maybe this whole hydrogen fuel cell thing, the reason why they can't go for the full race is maybe the FIA is a little bit hesitant of having a hydrogen fuel cell on track, and what are the safety precautions? How do you refuel that vehicle safely? That's always been the conversation about hydrogen fuel cells, is the safety aspect of it. So I'm sure maybe this is a test bed of Toyota being all right, we'll do a handful of laps, we'll test it out, we'll make sure everything's safe, and then we can come back in the future to try to go for the whole thing.
That's right. Yeah, the premise being extremely explosive gases under high compression. That's still stuff we're figuring out how to do in that area. Yeah, we want to be careful. And, oh, by the way, maybe you've heard there's a history at Le Mans of things going not so well. If you're not so familiar with that, go back and listen to our episode called The Mercedes Curse. Exeed, in particular, doesn't just have ambitions for motorsports, right? They have existing passenger cars out on the road, and they just launched a new one, the Exeed EX7, with what they're calling electronic mechanical braking systems. and another one called the Xlantix ESGS. Okay, well, maybe not the best names in the world, but just recently unveiled at the 2026 Beijing Auto Show, kind of focused on long-range, high-speed electric performance cars. So they're getting more involved in this space, even though here's yet another company that we really have no awareness of whatsoever. And let's continue on with this, right? The Geely Corporation or the Geely Group we've heard of before, and there's a reason for this. Geely is now a conglomerate that owns a bunch of legacy brands like Volvo and Lotus, Polestar, Smart Car, and this thing called Zeekr. And interestingly enough, talk about traditional brands, this company also owns and makes the London black cabs, the taxis that drive around in London that look like they're like from the 1930s or whatever. Yeah. That's now owned by this company, Geely, who makes those, among other things. They have a brand called Lynk, L-Y-N-K, Lincoln Company. And I think maybe that's supposed to sound a little like Lincoln. And we've seen this before where Chinese brands will name themselves something that's familiar to Western names to make it more trusted. Yeah. And the reason that made me remember that was I was looking at a battery system for my house, and one of the players in the market is called Franklin. And I looked into Franklin, and Franklin is a Chinese company. Of course, Benjamin Franklin, well associated with electricity. Yes. They are borrowing some of that real estate, if you will, to name their company something that people trust here in the West. And so Link and Company, Geely, that's not a bad idea, actually. One other really interesting wrinkle, flashing back to something that we talked about with BYD and this being a separate company, Geely owns a 17% equity stake in Aston Martin.
So it's interesting. Why wouldn't Geely be the ones that are going after and trying to talk to Aston Martin F1 to be like, hey, let's develop a partnership? Like, why would they be allowing BYD to kind of come in unless maybe there is a relationship between Geely and BYD? I don't know how the whole relationships work over in the Chinese automotive market.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of fragmentation in the market. It turns out Geely winds up being involved in TCR racing. So there's
fascinating.
There's touring car stuff that's happening and some interesting sort of Chinese market racing that we have zero idea about. Geely produced a sustainable race car that they called the Green Methanol Super League Pro in the Xingyao 6 race car, and it ran on methanol fuel, which was being presented as a somehow more sustainable, environmentally friendly alternative to some other fuels. Then they have a partner in a group called Cyan Racing, cyan like blue, that they're trying to get involved with so Lincoln Company can get more into international racing. But they are more in the TCR space. So it could just be that the flavor of racing each of these companies is sort of orienting to is just different. And so they're combining or separating out their entity and their efforts based on the requirements of the different series.
It's so cool and kind of blows my mind that so many of these companies have an interest in getting involved in motorsport. And
right.
It's kind of like the old days where it's like if you wanted to be established amongst a consumer base, you went racing. You proved yourself of like, hey, we can survive an endurance race, or we can develop the most sophisticated technology for F1, or, developing a fan base because they're winning on the weekends of like, oh, wow, look, they're banging doors in TCR or some touring car championship or whatever the case is. And it's kind of fascinating. They're taking a page out of like the Western automotive book, whether it's the Europeans or the Americans of, you want to win over, the consumer base, prove yourself. And proving yourself in motorsports proves that, one, you can be reliable, that you have the technology to develop, these sophisticated systems to be competitive in racing and things like that. And so it's kind of like a really weird resurgence of this mentality, albeit now it's because of hybrid and EV systems, but there still is this resurgence, which kind of makes for a cool space going forward within motorsports.
Yeah, these companies feel like they have something to prove because they do. So they're going to have to get out there and really blow doors and show up the other existing entities if they're going to make a splash in this field. And so far, it's looking like they're getting ready to do that. We have another company called Dongfeng. Dongfeng has a car called the Aeolus Yushan, which they've anglicized or westernized to the Shine, the car that they call their Shine.
That's much easier to say.
Yeah, I'll use that instead. It's their primary racing platform. It's a 1.5-liter turbo engine. Interesting, just a little tiny gas plant thing, but it is gas. They are involved in the CTCC, which you probably hadn't heard of, but you can probably map if you're familiar with WTCC or BTCC. This is the China Touring Car Championship. And the Dongfeng, their team called the Aeolus Racing Team, won in 2020 and 2021 for the first time back to back. So they've been doing this, for at least 5-6 years. They're racing these cars. And they interestingly, so some things don't quite translate to the Western market. They have a model of their car called the E-Pi 007. And let me repeat that, the E-Pi 007. The only place I'd ever seen anything quite that weird, geeky, or nerdy was when I worked at Google. And on our campus, there were buildings that were named Building E and Building Pi, like those interesting numbers from mathematics. So yeah, that's what they've chosen to name their car. Kind of weird.
Yeah, I saw that name and I was like, oh yeah, dude, the E-Pi 007 model, like that thing's got to be like crazy. That's got to be like their top of the line supercar, scissor doors, whatever. I like looked it up and it's just a generic sedan. And I'm like,
yeah,
you can't name something 007 and expect us not to think like James Bond, like some, secret agent mobile, and then it's just like a road-going luxurious sedan.
And calling it the E-Pi 007, I picture like a room full of comic book guys, Silicon Valley nerds that think they're really smart, trying to line up for this car, and then it's not very cool, actually.
Like, it's kind of crazy that, there is a bunch of racing that's going on in China that we haven't really considered. Like, we're thinking that these Chinese manufacturers are coming out of nowhere and have been doing nothing. And it's like, no, like, they've been establishing themselves in that market space for a very long time.
That's right.
They've been racing for a decent amount of time. Like, it's not a new thing that they're going into. They've been proving themselves. It's just kind of like it's taken a little bit of time for them to make that step of getting into more of like the well-known spotlight racing of WEC or IMSA or anything like that to get involved in these series. But, I mean, they're proving themselves, albeit in their own backyard, but they're doing it.
Yeah, and we've gone from, it was in 2003 that we had the first Chinese driver to test an F1 car and actually compete in IndyCar, to just a few years ago, we had Zhou Guanyu, full-time driver in F1 from China. So they're getting more present and more involved in this landscape at these levels. And their ambitions are to go and compete and be plausible and to win. And then you have another company, Great Wall Motors, another one of these consortiums that really makes a lot of SUVs and off-roading type vehicles. They're already competing in long-distance rally racing. And there's a race called the Taklimakan Rally, which I don't really know anything about, but they call that the Dakar of the East. That's racing here in 2026 with their vehicle, the Great Wall Motors GWM Tank 700, the Tank 700, which is a full-size plug-in hybrid SUV that's been designed for off-roading, right? So they're going after the Defender and G-Wagon and cars like that. It's a 3-liter twin-turbo V6 plus electric motor, so they are doing combustion and EV here. And the looks of the car, I have to say it's a little ungainly, a little awkward. It's been described as a mix of a G-Class, like the G-Wagon Mercedes, and a Suzuki Jimny.
I could definitely see that, or even like a Nissan Patrol is in there somewhere.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
It does kind of look like a smash of maybe 3 different luxury SUVs. The front is, you'd have to get used to, but the rear profile of it, kind of sick. Like the rear end, it's got like boxy fenders to it.
Yeah.
It's got a look. It's got a style.
Yeah, there was a little bit of old Land Cruiser in there maybe. There were some vibes,
Yeah, there's a little bit of, some flavor in there, like more so than I was expecting when I looked it up.
Yeah, so they're trying, right? We can give them credit for that. Now, listen to this, okay? When you buy one of these cars, you get a warranty from the manufacturer, and there's like a powertrain warranty and like, body, whatever. The engine and the transmission warranty on this car, 10 years, 1 million kilometers. I mean, that's something like I've never heard of in my life.
Interesting. Because you'd assume that like any of our impressions of a Chinese car is just going to be like cheap, disposable. It's going to compost itself into the dirt.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably not a hybrid car on the planet that's gone 1 million kilometers.
They're showing themselves as like, legitimate competitors.
Right. Yeah. And they either believe that they're going to be that reliable that they can stand up to those claims, or they can survive all the warranty claims that they're going to get, given that, tremendous number that they put out there, and
Right.
they'll be able to manage it. But it's pretty impressive. They were at the 2026 Beijing Motor Show where they unveiled their new platform for their upcoming supercar. It's carbon fiber monocoque. It's a mid-mounted, so a mid-engine car. It's a hybrid. It's a 4-liter V8. This is starting to sound kind of familiar to some other things that we know that's out there.
It's kind of starting to sound good. Like, that's the other thing is, like, I always assumed that all these cars coming out of China are just going to be electric or hybrid or, like, lame. Like, a V8 hybrid, albeit it is a hybrid, like, I don't know, it sounds enticing. Carbon fiber monocoque, like, sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of structure we'd want. And Great Wall Motors, GWM, right? They're gonna make this car in both a road-going and race car GT3 version. So here we are with ambitions to enter endurance racing, sports car racing, and the like. They've hired ex-McLaren engineer Adam Thompson, who's helping to design the car from the ground up. So another one of these stories where we take somebody with a track record and pedigree for having developed successful vehicles for the Western world and is over in China helping them do the same. And their goal is to get to this level to produce something that's going to be very different from a McLaren. That's what's been stated. And their estimates are that it could produce more than 1,000 kilowatts from the hybrid V8. So that's a lot of horsepower.
Yeah, and I mean, if these things start winning races in the GT3 class, I mean, might have to accept if it's that competitive.
It's the truth. I think so. This is what we're going to see. In the next several years, we're going to see plausible Chinese hypercars and sports cars entering in GT3 sports car racing, in prototype hypercar level endurance racing, at the top level of Formula open wheel Formula One racing, and maybe some things that we haven't even thought about. I mean, they're off competing in rally and touring car, and like we haven't really even scratched the surface on those championships, those series that are out there running. I think the implications are we're likely to see the return of the F1 race in Shanghai.
Yeah,
right? That went
absolutely.
away for a while. There used to be a Shanghai 6-hour endurance race that WEC would participate in. I'll bet we see that back. I would almost guarantee that you're going to see in China what we saw in the Middle East over the last few years with new racetracks popping up on the schedule for F1, and we'll see the same in the endurance world, and more sharing, more platform overlap, and more partnerships between these teams because it's just expensive to operate globally in all markets of the world. So, if you have to drive your trucks from the West Coast to the East Coast every other weekend, you're going to make friends with somebody in the East Coast to leave your trucks there. And I think we'll expect the same kind of arrangements to occur here. Maybe this adds another WEC race every year. WEC's a kind of a short series, and this is going to add some more travel for them. They're shipping those cars all over the world. You don't really think about it, but, when there's a quick turnaround for a race, like they're flying all these expensive hypercars and tires and supplies and stuff around. IMSA, we should expect to probably, make some changes in relation to this as well. Given that we have the common requirements between IMSA and WEC on the endurance and sports car racing side, what will the Chinese influence bring into those series such that we'll see them wanting to welcome new life, new blood, new money and investment into their series such that they may be accommodating? It's really up to the next few years for us to see how this is all going to go, but it's definitely a time where the game is changing, and I think anybody who is dismissive of Chinese companies or Chinese automobiles as plausible, potentially reliable, high-performance vehicles that would be desirable by people here in the U.S., I think you're going to whiff. I think you're going to miss something that's coming soon, and it's going to be here before any of us realize. So there's a matter of sort of getting used to the way things are coming and versus resisting it.
Yeah.
And, maybe our natural inclination is to resist this because it's unknown and it's uncomfortable in some ways, but maybe we can sort of be at the forefront of it and learn how to embrace it in a way where we can still be true to ourselves and our principles, but allow this new thing to come in and add to what we have that's already pretty good.
It'll be interesting to see how this transition starts, and I think it's going to be very quick that we see Chinese manufacturers get involved in GT3, TCR. If the BYD deal happens for F1, I mean, I think that's going to take a little bit of time just because we see how complicated it is for any manufacturer to get involved in F1. And
yeah, look how long it took Cadillac Andretti to get their entry.
Exactly. So, I mean, there's going to be complications there. I think the only hesitation that I could foresee of Chinese manufacturers getting involved in IMSA is that they wouldn't have any reason to be in IMSA if they can't sell their cars here in the U.S.
Right.
I mean, yes, they're involved in North America because they've been selling cars in Mexico from China.
Right.
And Canada just recently approved Chinese cars to be sold in Canada as well. Now, Canada's still being very restrictive of how many cars can be imported per month and all that sort of stuff. You know, the U.S. is still holding off from, you know, the legislative side of things. And I think that'll be the most fascinating thing to see is like, at what point does our government finally accept them moving into the marketplace? Or are they going to continue to protect the U.S. manufacturers from this influx of new competition? And that, I think, will delay their involvement in motorsports because there's no reason to race on U.S. tracks if they can't sell cars on U.S. soil.
That's true. And there is a point for them to be present in a market, which is to deliver on their own commercial ambitions, sell vehicles.
Right.
Some of it is brand reflection, though, right? Some of it is maybe there are people who affiliate with your origin, your nationality, but don't have an option to buy a product from that place, but live somewhere else, right? There's a lot of Chinese people who are now Chinese American living in the United States that maybe if there was a Chinese offering available, they would feel really strong about and they'd want that. Or maybe just the opposite. They'd say, no, I absolutely want to buy the American car, not the Chinese car.
Right.
But what we'll see is in racing, where we say that innovation is the same name as cheating or working through or around the rules, we know that while these cars are not allowed to be imported into the United States as passenger road-going cars, you can bring anything to the racetrack that's not licensed for the road if you get the appropriate exemptions from the DOT and the EPA. So if that's the case and they're racing in Canada or they're driving in Canada, they have passenger cars in Canada, they have passenger cars in Mexico, racers are going to find a way to bring them into the U.S. and get them in a series. And if IMSA doesn't accept them, then maybe it'll be SRO. Or maybe it'll be some other, maybe, second-tier organization, third-tier organization to allow it as the entry point, because racers are going to see these cars and say, if these things conform to the spec and they have the performance attributes that are being heralded as even remotely close to true, I want to drive that car because I want to win, and that sounds like a car I can win in.
It'll just be fascinating of like what the next steps are. Like 100%, the next step is the Chinese are coming and they're going to be involved in motorsports and they're going to have their stake in the ground. What percentage stake they're going to have in each series is to be determined, but they're going to be there. And it's going to be interesting to see that transition happen.
Yeah, I think no matter how you look at it, here come the Chinese hypercars. And you can accept them, you can reject them, but either way, they're coming.
Yeah, and it might be just like the Corvette was so successful in fending off the European supercars because it was affordable. And I think that's the biggest advantage they have of, you want this car that has this performance capability,
right?
Albeit it might not have the nameplate that you're looking for, but at the price tag, who can beat it?
1966, Ford versus Ferrari. 2066, Chevy versus Xiaomi.
Might possibly be.
Who knows? Stay tuned. We're all going to find out, I guess. This is exciting. We're all part of it. You could pay attention or you could be surprised later.
Well, this has been a fun conversation. I know we've been kind of joking about the whole Chinese car market and this, that, the other, but it's been interesting to dive into, and it's fascinating to see how involved these manufacturers already are and kind of where things are going from there. So thanks for a fun conversation, Todd.
Thanks, Sylas.
And thanks for listening. This has been Cold Start.